Yeah.
Yeah.
It was such a good
Okay, we are. This is it.
Yeah. Yeah. So. I had some not like.
Yeah, so he makes them like as written. It's awesome.
Can they hear now? If I'm standing closer to the. Talk into the thing. Testing. Can they hear me now? Is it a little bit better? I think so. We might not have audio right now. Potentially. It looks like it's all set up and all good. But...
Sometimes the connection just gets funky.
Okay. Can they hear?
Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot of background, but I think it's just.
That should be blue.
Okay, that should be blue.
Generally speaking.
Oh, God.
When it works.
Well, I'm gonna try the second microphone for it.
Do you have, is that enabled right now? Like, do you have? There are other people that are better with this thing.
If I can help you here.
Yeah, okay.
I've selected it on Zoom. I think it's good. Okay. I think it's okay.
It is it's off that way. It's not.
I.
Yeah.
I don't know why it's not. Well, it's quieter now. Is the noise decreased?
As far as I can tell people online so they can hear.
Okay, well.
If there's so many people. Yeah.
No,
Well, you have a TED Talk mic though.
next time.
So maybe just like stand next to this. picture.
I'll stand closer.
Or we-
All right,
Let's go.
let's go. All right. Hey, all. Welcome to the seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker. My name is Brian Beamer. Trevor's been doing his PhD in my lab for the past 3 years, so it's just exciting to get to this point. It's been wonderful. Trevor's done a lot of work that he won't tell you about for some reason, despite us telling him to use this time to brag a little bit. Trevor came to my lab in 2002 from Wyoming, where he got his master's, and he actually has published 5 papers since getting here. Only one of which will be featured today, oddly enough. So he's been just an incredibly productive student and scholar in the field, and across a variety of fields. He's an intense collaborator. It's been fun having him in the lab. I mean, when he first showed up, I brought him to Alaska because he did his fieldwork in Alaska, which was sweet. And enthusiasm outstripped. I think he showed up with leather boots in a place where you need like rubber everywhere. And a desire to bring tuna, which is in the world of like coastal brown bears. Generally not, well, I was looking at the boots and then I found an email, hey, I'm gonna bring some tuna. Literally the worst thing you can bring. It's like inviting the bear into your city. And so that's how it started. And then by the end, I mean, he's leading the field work on his own. I mean, the guy's an amazing scholar, despite a lot of challenges. I mean, on his last field trip, a boat sunk and disappeared. Literally, it's not his boat, but and then COVID. I mean, there's been a lot of challenges, you know, as you've all experienced in the world that is today. And it's just been amazing to have Trevor and work with Trevor this whole time. So I'm really excited about what he's been able to do, both what you'll see and again, what you won't see in terms of all the stuff he's done. He's already had several postdoc job offers and he's all set up. I mean, his big strength is planning ahead so far. You probably have like your retirement plan. So anyway, enjoy the talk and put your hands together for Trevor.
All right, I said I wouldn't cry, but I really want to thank you all for coming here. It's truly, I would not be standing here if it wasn't for the effort and dedication that I have received as help from both the people in this room and also on Zoom. And so with that, I'm really ecstatic to talk about some of the work that I've been doing for the last 3-ish years. I want to start by setting up the clicker to advance my slides properly or not. I bought this thing on Amazon specifically for this event. And it looks like we may or may not be able to use it. Anyway, I want to start by introducing my research, not in terms of my dissertation projects, but how I think about ecology and my research more broadly. And I take it back to this one singular large question of why are plants where they are? And this is a huge question that is deceptively complicated and also very old. We can trace some of the foundations of this question back to this man right here, Alexander von Humboldt, who was an esteemed early 19th century German polymath. He was a natural historian. He was an artist hired by the Spanish crown to go out on expeditions to document species and create these very beautiful illustrations like we see here that document in a very intuitive way what plants we see across an elevational gradient in a mountain ecosystem. I like to think about this question about why plants are where they are a little bit more specifically. I like to think about how do disturbances modify the process of plant community assembly. And when I'm talking about plant community assembly, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. We have some potential regional species pool that contains all of the species across a landscape. And that regional species pool gets filtered down to a subset that we can call the realized plant community on the landscape. To go from the regional species pool to this realized plant community, species must first disperse into a landscape. So they first must make it into this area. After they've made it into the area, they must deal with a variety of abiotic conditions. We can think of things like temperature or hydrology, which might be precipitation or the timing or quantity of precipitation. We can think about nutrient availability or light availability. All of these things are important for the plants on a landscape. Finally, we also have things like biotic interactions. So they're interacting with their neighbors. This might be through a more Darwinian sense of competition, or it might also be through a more facilitative effect. And while I've presented these ideas sort of as one, then the next, these processes are really all happening at the same time in plant communities. Very seldomly do we have an opportunity to study them in direct succession, one after the other. So it's really interesting to understand how these things might change. Something that is able to change the filters of plant community assembly are disturbances. They can alter the strength of each of these filters. Another thing that has the potential to impact plant communities is global climate change. We have a lot of research now documenting how plant communities have changed through time, sort of tied back to global climate change. And so a very striking example is the resampling of some of Alexander von Humboldt's original surveys in Chimborazo in Ecuador, where on the left here, we see the maps generated from Humboldt in 1802, which documents sort of the ranges of these plant communities that he described. And then 120 years later, the Moretta-Holm research team went out and resampled the same face, used as much of similar methodology as they could to demonstrate where these plant communities are currently found on the landscape. And there's been a change in these plant communities. So what's really interesting about this is that global climate change has the potential to influence plant communities, but at the same time, plant communities uptake CO2, which is a primary greenhouse gas. And some plant communities take up CO2 more than other plant communities. For example, we can look at a map of global terrestrial vegetative biomass, which is primarily carbon, right? We can look that there are some areas in dark green that have higher carbon and other areas in light green that have lower carbon. And if we think about global geography, we can kind of key out that forests are generally associated with this higher carbon areas. In fact, forests store the majority of above ground terrestrial biomass, between 60 to 80%, depending on which metric you're using or which estimate you're including. And so when I'm talking about forest carbon and where it's stored, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with how forest carbon is stored. There are a variety of different pools that carbon can be stored in. We have the above ground live tree biomass pool. This is sort of what we might think of initially when we think about forest carbon. These are our trees, our woody material, our live trees. But we also have things like below ground biomass or the understory, leaf litter and dead wood, things that also exist and contribute to total carbon storage in an ecosystem. And finally, we also have this soil pool. This soil matrix stores a lot of carbon. There's generally a trade-off that we might think of between looking at forests closer to the tropics towards forests that are more higher in latitudes, where carbon in more tropical forests tend to store more carbon, about 60%, in above ground live tree biomass. That's this green pool here. And only about a third in below ground biomass or below ground, the soil organic layer or the soil matrix. However, as we move more northern, we see more carbon stored in this soil layer here and less carbon stored in our above ground live tree biomass. It's important to understand how much carbon is stored in forests because increasingly there have been conversations about the use of natural systems to mitigate climate change. This idea has been popularized by Griscom et al. From 2017, Proceedings National Academy of Science. The term is generally thrown around of nature-based climate solutions. The idea that we can manage natural systems to mitigate climate change through the offset of emissions, primarily in carbon dioxide. And we'll notice that in general, forested ecosystems up top across the board have these large climate change mitigation potential. So these bars are really wide. They have a lot of potential to mitigate climate change. We can also notice, however, that there's a lot of error around all of these estimates, but specifically in forests that sort of provide an uncertainty for how good these natural systems might be for mitigating climate change. Part of that reason is that policies and global management sort of derive inferences from these global scale models like we have here. So we can see again the distribution of carbon, areas where it is high in dark brown and areas where it is low. And while these global models are really useful for understanding broad scale trends in the distribution of carbon and where it might be across the globe, they're really poor at understanding fine scale variability. That's because they weren't intended to. These models at the global scale are not necessarily intended at capturing the fine scale processes that dictate carbon accumulation and storage, like topography and slope or things like disturbances. Regional models do a lot better job understanding those fine scale processes. So we can see here in Madagascar, we get a general sense of where the carbon is distributed across the landscape, but when we use a regional modeling approach, we can pick out fine scale variability a lot easier. Another example of this is work done by Gavin McNichol in the permanently humid ecoregion, which is part of Southeast Alaska and coastal British Columbia. And he was doing this sort of similar comparison of global and regional models for the soil organic layer. And so we have here a global model on the left and a regional model here on the right. And we can see that the global model is generally predicting less soil organic carbon, about 100 to 200 megagrams of carbon per hectare, whereas this regional model here is predicting between 300 to potentially 500 megagrams of carbon per hectare, at least for this part of the region. And so this region that Gavin McNichol studied, which was part of the Pacific temperate coastal rainforest, this rainforest is the largest temperate rainforest in the globe. It spans over 23 degrees of latitude and over 36,000 kilometers squared. It stretches from Kodiak Island, Alaska, all the way down the coast of Southeast Alaska, the coast of British Columbia, the coast of Washington, the coast of Oregon, and most of the coast of California, terminating in Big Sur State Park, California. So this is a very, very large forest. And when you have very, very large forests, you might want to subdivide them into different ecoregions or zones to make studying them a little bit more manageable. One of the zones, and the zone that we're going to be talking about today, is the per-humid ecoregion, or the per-humid zone. This region spans 10 degrees of latitude, and in landmass area is about the size of Greece. So that's about 14 million hectares, if that does anything for you. The region spans between Southeast Alaska and coastal British Columbia, so it crosses geopolitical borders, but we don't really anticipate that the forest differs between Southeast Alaska and coastal British Columbia. It has the same climatic and topographic contexts throughout. It is derived from, the per-humid name rather, is derived from the fact that it is constantly wet. There's no definable dry season in this ecoregion. There's between 2 to 5 meters of precipitation annually. And so to put that into perspective, I am about 2 meters tall. So this amount of precipitation is on the low end. Imagine stacking 2.5 of me. That's a lot of water coming down. There's also relatively moderate temperatures across this area. I want to show you some pictures since a lot of us probably haven't been to this part of the world, and this is an ecology talk. So let's ooh and ah some really pretty pictures of forests. So this is at the northern end of the study region. This is just inside of Glacier Bay National Park, where that boat sank that Brian was mentioning. We can see that these are fairly large trees, a relatively mountainous and steep topography system. This is just outside of Juneau, showing you some sort of steep topography. We also have some areas that are relatively flat and tend to accumulate water on the surface, but also support trees without drowning them. Other areas, back to Glacier Bay National Park, have been recently deglaciated, and so do not have a very large soil organic layer or soil layer of any sort, and have relatively small trees as they're regenerating. There are also interspersed muskegs, which are sort of this half wetland, half forest, which does have forest cover. These are shore pines or lodgepole pines that we have out in the Rocky Mountains. And they're on top of these peat bogs that are many meters deep and store a lot of carbon below ground. So overall, carbon in the per-humid, we know that high precipitation, moderate temperatures, and infrequent disturbance regimes lead to this accumulation of carbon. And we know that a lot of the carbon is stored below ground, about 66%. And this has been modeled spatially again by Gavin McNichol back in 2019. When I'm talking about these infrequent disturbance regimes, I want to bring to mention that there has been no evidence of large fires for the past 5,000 years, which was the last glacial maximum for this part of the world. And when I'm talking about disturbance regimes, I'm talking about things like landslides. So we can see here pretty clearly that there was a landslide event, a singular event that occurred on the landscape. But if we look closely, we might see the historic evidence of previous landslides on this forest in generally the same topographic conditions. We need very steep slopes and a lot of precipitation in order for an area to slide. And so these might have a higher relative probability of giving way to a landslide than sort of these flat areas of the landscape. We're able to characterize that. We also have windstorms. And so we can see the evidence of a windstorm here. And it might not show up very clearly for those in the back, but all of these trees have been blown down in a straight line because the windstorms in this region are relatively predictable. We have extratropical cyclones, which behave very similar to hurricanes. They're these big swirling storms that come through and knock down trees on these relatively predetermined storm tracks. And that's based off of atmospheric physics, things like the Coriolis effect. But again, we're able to understand which areas are more likely to have windstorms than those that are not. I also want to draw our attention to these brownish areas on the landscape. These are parts of these muskeg forests that I mentioned previously. So these are not disturbed per se, they're just very wet. In fact, so wet that they don't support above ground tree biomass. So finally, I want to talk about logging. This is a relatively intuitive disturbance to understand in terms of where we once had trees on the landscape. A company came in and they removed the trees on the landscape. So we don't have above ground tree biomass carbon. So while we do have data for this disturbance type, there is some information that is missing just due to the fact that early imperialists and colonials didn't really record their logging polygons really well. So we don't have that data. But for the last 100 years, we do have relatively consistent logging data for this region. So carbon in the perhumid. We know that this area stores a lot of carbon, both above ground and below ground. However, what we don't know is the spatially explicit estimate of above ground biomass carbon for the whole ecoregion. We don't know how carbon is distributed across this landscape in a spatially explicit manner. We don't know the simultaneous spatial relationship of above ground and below ground carbon stocks for the region. And we don't know how carbon management might interact with other management goals, such as plant biodiversity. So to address these questions, the first thing that I did was generate a map of the above ground live tree biomass carbon stocks. And I used a variety of data sets. So I used the US Forest Service inventory and analysis data set, which is a countrywide protocol that was initiated by the Forest Service, where every about 10 years they sample plots spread spatially across the United States. So this has relatively good coverage for Southeast Alaska. We have the British Columbia equivalent, which is the Forest Analysis and Inventory Branch. This is a relatively newer protocol. And so while we do have spatial coverage for British Columbia, it is a little bit less than Southeast Alaska. This was a lot of data. I do want to reiterate that now. As Brian was mentioning, this is my one chance to really brag about myself. This was over 2,000 plots spanning, again, about 10 million hectares of forested landscape. And so this is a very large data set and a very large landscape that I was able to model. The models that I used a machine learning model framework. I specifically used quantile regression forest, which is very similar to a random forest, where decision trees are able to draw correlations in the data and to make really good predictions. However, what differentiates it from a random forest is the fact that quantile regression forests allow you to specify different quantile outputs that visualize the spatial uncertainty or the spatially explicit prediction intervals for each of these raster cells. I'm not going to be talking about the quantile regression forests too much, just due to an interest of time, but if you are interested, I'd be happy to discuss some of those results. Finally, I used generalized linear models to understand the relative effects, or the partial effects rather, of climate and topography and disturbances on above ground live tree biomass for the region, and then also for the relationship between biomass and plant biodiversity. So now is the opportunity to show again that this is this very large study region. The spatial distribution of plots is a little bit better in Southeast Alaska, a little bit worse in British Columbia, but we do have a full spatial coverage. We do assume that this is a representative sample because this region is more or less similar in terms of climate and topography across the area. So let's dive into the results. The first map that I'm going to show you is what I'm calling an unconstrained estimate. This unconstrained estimate gets its name because when you are out on the field and measuring the forest inventory and analysis or forest analysis and inventory branches, branch plots data sets, you're recording things like a tree's diameter and a tree's height. And that's not a tree's carbon. A tree's carbon has to be mathematically derived through the use of allometric equations, unless you're cutting down each and every tree that you are measuring, which obviously probably wouldn't be the best use of time for a 3-year dissertation. When you're using allometric equations, these allometric equations are built upon real data sets. So people went out, they measured a tree's diameter, they measured a tree's height in a region, they cut it down, they counted up how much carbon is in that tree. And they're building mathematical models to express this relationship between diameters and heights. However, all allometric equations are inherently limited based on the size of trees that you include to build your models. And we occasionally had trees that were outside of the range of any known allometric equations. And so this makes it difficult, if not impossible, to quantify the error when you are looking at data outside of the range of allometric equations. I do want to note that allometric equations do have error associated with them. And this has been done before by people in Brian's lab previously. Kyle Turchik did a really interesting study looking at the error associated between allometric equations. We decided to go with the Kozak allometric equation, which allows us to account for things with broken tops, which in our eyes allowed for a little bit better estimates. Anyway, the unconstrained estimate has all of the trees in our data set at the size that they are, even the ones outside of the range of allometric equations. On average, I estimate that this forest stores 218 megagrams of carbon per hectare stored as above ground live tree biomass. The spread on this average is relatively large, which is not necessarily surprising since our forests are covering places across an elevational gradient and across latitudes. So it is not necessarily surprising that we see a large variability associated with this mean. I also want to draw our attention to the fact that this storage, I'm estimating, stores in total 2.5 petagrams of carbon. That is equivalent to 1.07% of global above ground forest carbon. So that number might not be impressive. I think it's terribly impressive. But to provide additional context, this forest only accounts for 0.3% of forest area. So I'm estimating that this forest stores 3 times what its area suggests in terms of above ground live tree biomass carbon alone. The next set of estimates are these truncated estimates. And so this is very similar methodology to the unconstrained estimate, but with those trees that were outside of the range of allometric equations, I essentially, in the model, capped off the max size to be within the range of allometric equations. And so this is a biased low estimate. We know that. We are removing the largest trees from the data set. We are truncating them to be a smaller size. And the largest trees generally store the most amount of carbon. The thing that I want to draw our attention to with this is that despite truncating the large tree sizes, we see very similar estimates, almost imperceptible when we're clicking through for our spatial estimates. Now, on average, I'm estimating 211 megagrams of carbon per hectare stored in above ground tree biomass. Again, similar spread to the data, and a similar total of 2.3 petagrams of carbon. This is a little bit less than 2.5. This is about 0.63% of global above ground forest carbon. So even when we are biasing our estimates low, we are still storing double what the area of forest would suggest in terms of above ground live tree biomass. I really wanted to understand what predicted above ground live tree biomass, because these machine learning techniques are really good at making predictions, but not really good at making interpretable predictions. So to do this, I utilized a generalized linear modeling framework on the actual plot data for both the forest inventory and analysis and forest analysis and inventory branch. So I used a generalized linear model that included the partial effects of things that we know influence biomass carbon storage, like topography, climate, and disturbance regimes. And the output of that is this large model table. And so I want to draw our attention to a few things. Things like temperature and slope were both statistically significant predictors of above ground live tree biomass. They had a positive effect. This is unsurprising. Increases in slope are hypothesized to lead to increases in drainage for this region. And this energy is thought, or this system is thought to be energy limited. So higher temperatures, increasing biomass carbon storage is something that has been documented in previous studies. What we did not observe is a statistically significant effect for our windstorm regime or our landslide regime. Rather, we observed statistically significant effects for logging, both in Southeast Alaska and coastal British Columbia. So let's look at logging a little bit more specifically. This is just an easier way to visualize and interpret some of these data. We see that logging decreases above ground carbon stocks, both in Southeast Alaska from unlogged to logged, and in British Columbia from unlogged to logged. And so in general, we see that this decline is in the order of hundreds of megagrams per hectare on average. There is a slightly larger effect in British Columbia, but it occurs for both. The important thing here to highlight is that logging occurs on only about 6% of this forest. The next thing I was curious about was to understand if logging occurs in areas that were disproportionately more likely to have windstorms or landslides. Because if we're logging on areas that might experience natural disturbances, this might be sort of a compounding effect about where we are logging on the landscape. And so here we have this relative probability of a windstorm. So this is just areas that are closer to this right are more likely on average across long run frequencies to experience windstorms than areas on the left. And these are frequency histograms, so we're just sampling the landscape in areas that were logged and unlogged. So logged here in yellow and unlogged here in blue. What we see is that these histograms overlap very heavily. They're basically the same distribution. Some slight variation. We don't see that the yellow or the log sites are way out over here. If they were, that would be indicative of us logging on areas with a higher relative probability of windstorms. Instead, they're relatively centered on the same area. So we're not disproportionately logging on areas that might experience more windstorms. Similarly, when we did this for landslides, we observed more or less the same thing, that these two histograms are very heavily overlapping. We might actually have a case to argue that logging occurs in areas with a lower relative probability of landslides. And from an economic standpoint, this makes sense. We don't want to log on areas that are really steep and difficult to get to. We'd prefer logging on areas that are flatter, and flatter areas have a lower relative probability of landslides. So after I had this estimate of above ground tree biomass, I wanted to understand how this relates to below ground carbon stocks, which if we remember back from that pie chart, represent the largest pool of below ground or of carbon in this ecosystem. And so I was able to use my map, pictured here in the top left, of above ground live tree biomass, and the map generated from Gavin McNichol in 2019 of soil organic carbon. Something to mention is that this is only soil organic carbon to 1 meter depth. And so if you look closely, you might see that the estimates are relatively similar despite soil organic carbon, in theory, storing more carbon above ground. This is because the soil organic carbon map is again biased low due to sampling efforts, constraints from Gavin's research. To make these two maps more comparable, the first thing that I did was turn them into percentiles, or areas relative to themselves that have high carbon, areas relative to themselves that have low carbon. So we see in yellow areas that relative to the rest of the map have high above ground carbon, areas in blue, places that have low above ground carbon. And again, the same thing for below ground. And we can start to visually just compare these two maps and understand that there are likely some areas that have low carbon in both areas or high carbon in both areas. And so I did exactly that, and I generated a map looking at carbon convergence and what I'm calling carbon divergence. So these are 4 different categories. I have 2 categories of what I'm calling carbon convergence. That's where the above ground pool and the below ground pool are behaving in the same way. When one is high, both are high. When one is low, both are low. Areas of carbon divergence are areas where one pool is doing one thing and the second pool is doing the opposite. So if one pool is high, the second pool is low, and vice versa. I might call these high total carbon and low total carbon. These are both areas of convergence. I might call them carbon hotspots or carbon cold spots. And areas of divergence, we have high above ground carbon, low below ground carbon, and the inverse, high below ground carbon, low above ground carbon. I also present here these gray areas. These are the moderate carbon conditions across the landscape, where both pools are just doing about the same thing, but not sort of extreme behaviors in either way. So let's look at what these landscapes might look like to provide, again, some additional visual context. So here, this might be an area which could be associated with a carbon hotspot. There are large trees in the background, but this area is also wet. So it's storing a lot of soil carbon as well. We have areas in brown here, which smaller trees, so carbon cold spots, and also less going on in the soil. We might anticipate areas with steep slopes to provide drainage, so we have less soil carbon being able to store on that landscape, but lots of above ground carbon. In the inverse, where we have high below ground carbon here, again, these many meter deep peat bogs, but lower amounts of above ground carbon being stored. So I was able to categorize these landscapes and quantify how much of the total landscape is associated with each of these categories. And so I'm estimating that about 25% of the landscape has carbon convergence. So both pools doing the same thing, about equally split between our carbon hotspots and our carbon cold spots. Less of the landscape, about 20%, is associated with carbon divergence, with more of that being associated with these high below ground and low above ground carbon storage areas. And unsurprisingly, most of the forest is associated with these moderate conditions for both above ground and below ground. I want to show you some of the topographic and climatic contexts associated with each of these categories. And so again, I have these histograms that show the proportion or the association of these categories across different climatic and topographic variables. So we have slope, elevation, aspect, which has not been linearly transformed, annual precipitation, and annual temperature. I want to draw our attention first to slope, where we see steeper slopes are associated with more above ground biomass. So this is both for our high total category and our low total category. Similarly, we see higher precipitation is associated with more below ground biomass. So again, our high total category and our high above ground and low below ground. We can make a general trade-off between these two things to understand the relationship. I do want to mention really quickly, when I'm saying low precipitation, this is still about 2 meters of precipitation. So this is still a lot of water on the landscape. It is just low compared to the rest of the forest, whereas high is, again, a little bit more than that, about a whole meter more. Our slope ranges from about 10 degrees to about 25 degrees. But we see areas with high precipitation and steeper slopes are those that are able to support, or more correlated rather, with areas that have high total, high above ground and low and high below ground. So both pools are both very high. I'm hypothesizing that this is likely because there's enough water on the landscape to both promote tree growth, but the drainage is well enough to not drown the trees. We still have a lot of water on the landscape that promotes soil organic or soil matter and soil carbon storage. But again, this is, we think, or I think rather, hypothesized to be controlled by precipitation. On the inverse, areas with lower slopes and lower precipitation, these are areas with less above ground and less below ground carbon. So likely, even though this is less precipitation, they're on sort of these flatter areas, and precipitation, or rather water, is able to accumulate at these areas. And so we are not able to have above ground carbon because these trees are drowned, but we have relatively less below ground carbon because there isn't enough precipitation to really promote high levels or be associated with high levels of below ground carbon. I want to bring this back now to the conversation that I introduced at the beginning about nature-based climate solutions, where we can identify areas with high total carbon or low total carbon, with this idea again in mind for the use of managing these systems for nature-based climate solutions. And that's all well and good if all of the landscape is available for management. However, that is not the case. So these data come from a paper that is in review right now from Colin Shanley at the Nature Conservancy, he was able to classify the landscape for the entire Pacific coastal temperate rainforest. So I'm only showing the per humid subset here into these 3 categories related to nature-based climate solutions. there are areas in green that are available currently for nature-based climate solution management actions. This is only about 7.7% of the landscape. While that's a small portion of the landscape, this is still about the size of Puerto Rico. More of the landscape is this yellow category of not available for action. So these are areas that might be private land or be close to wetlands or some sort of administrative delineation that prevents active land management being occurred in that area. We also have areas that are protected. So these might be reserves or national parks, things like that. So bringing it back to the 7.7% that is available for action, 136,000 hectares, which is a lot of land, are areas that are associated with high above ground and high below ground carbon, and they are currently within this available for action. And so these might make good places to conserve forests in order to offset climate change in some way, shape, or form. So finally, I want to understand how carbon management, specifically above ground, might interact with other management goals, specifically biodiversity, which is another large conversation in terms of forest management at this point. A lot of the conversation about the co-management of forest carbon and forest biodiversity is generally centered on research that investigates the relationship between tree biomass carbon and bird species richness, which makes sense. We have large trees that store a lot of carbon. These large trees also provide a lot of habitat, potentially for a variety of bird species, a lot of different niche space. And so I'm not going to pretend that these are exactly accurate to which part of the forest they might habitate, but large trees, lots of structure is hypothesized to promote both carbon and bird species richness. And again, on the inverse, smaller trees, less carbon, less bird species richness. However, this hypothesis likely doesn't hold for the otherwise most taxonomically numerous member of forest communities, which are understory plants, sort of the often forgotten part about forests in terms of plants, right? We have these large trees that store a lot of carbon, but they're also really good competitors for the understory. And so we might anticipate a trade-off where large trees, lots of carbon, good competitors, but small trees, less carbon, less good competitors, more species are able to be present in this landscape. So again, I used a subset of the forest inventory and analysis data set. This was only available for Southeast Alaska that had the understory species data. And I used a generalized linear model that included both the partial effects of climate and topography, in addition to biomass to understand the relationship with big trees. So what I observed was that areas that have biomass carbon, lots of biomass carbon, were generally associated with lower plant species richness than plots that had lower biomass carbon and were associated with more understory species richness. So this was a statistically significant decline of about 2 species per increase in about 50 megagrams of carbon per hectare. However, because I did not collect this data, I wanted to understand how sensitive this effect was to the inclusion of a variety of species. So I did this with 3 different subsets. We have the black line here, which represents all species. We have this yellow line here, which represents only angiosperm species present in the data set. And these are species that might be of potential management concern. They are good habitat and forage for things like Sitka deer. So if you're a land manager, you want to understand how your angiosperms might change. I included this for that reason. Finally, in blue, I have species with functional trait data. And so functional trait data provides insights into potential mechanisms that might help to explain this relationship. And I'm not going to talk about these functional trait data here, just again, due to time, but if you are curious, I'd be happy to answer questions about that. What I observed is that there was still a statistically significant decline across all of these categories. However, the magnitude of this effect did diminish based off of an exclusion of species. So as we excluded more species, the trend got flatter and flatter. In addition to understanding things like species richness, I also wanted to understand species diversity, which incorporates not only the number of different species that are present on the landscape, but how abundant they are in those communities. So I used the Simpson's Diversity Index, which is sort of a measure of dominance in the landscape. And while I observed a trade-off here with species richness that was statistically significant, I did not observe a trade-off with these Simpson diversity metrics across any of any of the included species. So whether it's all species, angiosperms, or just those with functional trait data. And so I'm hypothesizing that this is likely because rare species are the ones that are being excluded from the landscape, which is not as well picked up in the Simpson's diversity metric. So to summarize, I want to bring this back into context of what this all means. That this ecosystem, this forest, is storing a disproportional amount of carbon, either twice or 3 times what its area would suggest. So between 0.63 and 1.07 stored, despite again 0.3% area. I'm hypothesizing that hydrology is controlling carbon storage as mediated through trade-offs of slope and precipitation, both above and below ground. And that the portion of this landscape that has carbon hotspots, these are prime candidates for additional carbon conservation. However, if we are managing for carbon, we must understand that management objectives have potential trade-offs. And that if we are managing for one thing, that doesn't mean that across the board, we have positive outcomes everywhere. So what comes next for me is understanding this role of hydrology a little bit more, specifically as it applies to the entire plant community, not just trees. I want to understand how the understory plant community is interfacing with these trees to lead to changes in plant communities across the landscape. I also want to understand how disturbance regimes and events interact with these understory plant communities a little bit more. And so with that, I would like to say thank you to so many people. Again, I couldn't be here without all of you in this room, all the people on Zoom. I would especially like to thank Brian, Dr. Kate Hayes, and Aaron, who have been tremendous helps and were part of a very phenomenal lab community. And I'm just going to take questions before I start crying. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great talk, Trevor. In terms of the effect of logging, I assume it has to do with, or there's a compounding effect of when the logging occurred. So at what point, sort of after the logging event, a succession of understory, the understory plants kind of switch it back to?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I have sort of a slide that will help answer this. Yep, this one right here. And so I was able to model the effect of time since logging, since there was a spread. And so we do observe that, yes, that the time since logging does have a statistically significant effect on how much biomass is stored. In general, the rotations for this landscape are sort of being put at about 100 years for the harvesting of young growth, which is a little bit different than the time that it might take for forests to reach a large structural complexity. However, there is evidence to suggest, based off of some of our plots, that within about 70 years, and again, this is very large variation based off of 3 plots here, that within 70 years, some plots could recover to be more closely related to this unlogged condition. However, some plots here still, about 70 years post-logging are not close. So yeah, the unfortunate answer is it depends. And I think it's going to depend in part on this hydrology and things that control tree biomass carbon storage across the landscape. Does that address your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Jimmy.
So that was a really interesting talk, Trevor. And sort of building off this question, the trees grow over time.
Mhm.
So can you sort of consider how the trees growing will affect their, like the proportion of above ground and below ground biomass as the forest continues to do its thing?
Yeah, just in terms of like a speculation of if as trees grow, they store more above ground biomass. I want to make sure I'm
How
understanding.
do you think the proportion of above ground to below ground biomass is going to change as the forest continues to grow?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So understanding how above ground and below ground biomass relationships might change based off forest growth. So something that I didn't talk about much today is sort of the expectations for climate change for this region, which plays into your question, I think, more than you might have initially suspected. So our expectations in terms of climate change are increases in temperature and increases in precipitation quantity. And because this ecosystem is energy limited, we might anticipate trees growing more. There's just more sunny days. So they're able to sort of store more, but that increase in water might also limit. And so this ties back to the topographic and climatic conditions that are sort of associated with areas that store a lot of carbon. And so for areas like these muskegs that sort of have a lower or associated with lower on average above ground live tree biomass, they're not likely to like keep growing and growing to the scale that, you know, some of these areas associated with both high above ground and high below ground carbon are. And that's just due to constraints in physiology based off of just there's too much water. And they're really sort of at their limit in terms of what they can stand in terms of stress. Is that get at your question?
So.
Okay, cool. Yes, Ally.
Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Curious, I know you had like a lot of issues with those allometric equations and in terms of like, estimating the carbon. Does your estimation provide me if it takes into account the understory vegetation?
It does not. So this is just above ground.
And then is there like any work to do like use LiDAR or something like that to like better estimate that structural volume, I guess?
Yeah, so that would be really interesting. So the question, I suppose I should be repeating all of these, is there any interest or availability of LiDAR to look at the structure of these forests? And so something that's really difficult with this forest in specific is just how much cloud cover there is and how much topographic, like there's a lot of slopes from fjords. And so it's really difficult to have any sort of Landsat technology just due to cloud cover. It's relatively inconsistent across the landscape, which is part of the reason why these methodology, although not perfect, sort of address the question to the best of our ability at this point. Yeah.
There are two questions online.
Oh, joke. Thank you.
First one from Lauren. Do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead and read it.
Is glacier melt significant in this landscape? If so, do you suspect that as glaciers continue to shrink, it will cause even further change in the plant community because of changing water availability?
Oh, that is a great question. So the question comes from Lauren about glacier melt in this ecosystem. And so that ties into a lot of other research that I have both in Glacier Bay National Park at this point and research that I'm trying to write into NSF proposals to understand how plant communities might change following glacial retreat. So glaciers, this is going to be a tangent, but glaciers are really, really cool because they are these disturbance types that sort of leave a blank slate and allow plant communities to assemble seemingly from scratch. However, that is sort of in quotes because the surrounding plant community is what's going to contribute to the plant community that we see sort of post disturbance. And so while there are a lot of things that interplay with this, like how fast the glacier is retreating, which yes, glaciers are retreating in this part of the world. Some tidewater glaciers are advancing at very slow rates. But by and large, we see glacial retreat in this area. And depending on how fast that is going to limit what plants are actually able to come into the landscape. So what we see in Glacier Bay right now, for example, is that ecosystems that experience very rapid glacial retreat are not reaching what we might think of as their like prime successional community, which are these mature spruce and hemlock forests, mostly due to what I'm hypothesizing as seed limitations, but that research is still forthcoming. So yes, very interesting stuff.
And there's another question from James, who says first, awesome talk, Trevor. Awesome. Also awesome solo time.
Thank you.
But their question is, being that you are showing there is less biodiversity in areas that store the most carbon, do you have recommendations for how to manage forests if our goal was to both store carbon while also managing for biodiversity and habitat? Is reserves a good answer, or should there be some overstory removal to promote biodiversity?
Yeah, so that's a really good question from James to understand sort of what are the recommendations if we want to have places that are carbon reserves. So I guess my answer to that, albeit imperfect, is to sort of understand for what management area you're actually using. So I was able to generate these regional scale models, which provide expectations across the region. However, if you are a land manager and you have sort of more local management sort of constraints to understand what are the conditions that you have on your landscape, and are there areas that might naturally promote understory biodiversity? So a key caveat to this was this trade-off that I reported is for forested ecosystems. But as we see from the pictures of those windstorms, this landscape is relatively patchy. There are some places that are forests and some places that are not. And so while it might be your management prerogative to store as much carbon in these forests as possible, areas with less forest cover sort of naturally due to hydrology and slope, those might be areas that sort of naturally provide more biodiversity. So, yeah. Great. Mylon.
This might be, sorry, that you may have already said it, but where did your estimate for the total global like carbon storage come from?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. Where does the estimate for like what constitutes global forest carbon? So I used a variety of different estimates. I used estimates from Kinderman et al. I think 2019. I'm a little fuzzy on the dates. Pan et al. And then there was a third one that I cannot recall off the top of my head. So those are three of the most recent estimates of global forest carbon storage above ground. And so there's about three three estimates that I'm using. But I'd be happy to send those. They're also in the manuscript that is accepted for Canadian Journal of Forest Research. So that should be forthcoming as well if you're curious. Yeah. Yes, Michelle.
Don't the other understory plants count for something for carbon storage? And do we have the estimates for them? And is there a balance between maybe more diversity doesn't mean less, needs less tree carbon, but it needs some carbon storage? So
Yes.
how do we know what these?
Yes, so that is a great question. I'm gonna go back to a slide at the very beginning.
Trevor, could you repeat the question?
Yes. So the question was, don't understory plants sort of count for something in terms of carbon? Okay, well, we might just be stuck at a figure of my residuals. So the question was, don't the understory plants count for something in terms of carbon on the landscape? And even though, there might be less above ground carbon, if there's more understory biodiversity, could that also be associated with more carbon? And so the figure that I was hoping to pull up was that pie chart that I had at the very beginning that showed from previous research has estimated about 66% is for below ground. The next single largest pool is above ground at about 15%. And the understory carbon pool for this is far, far less at depending on the estimate, I think it's about 2.5, maybe 3%. So it is pretty low. So while understory plants do, yes, store carbon, it's just a lot less than the above ground live tree biomass. These trees are really, really large. I didn't get a chance to do they're this big and this tall, but it's very common to have trees that are over 1 meter in diameter and about 70 meters tall. So these are really large trees. And while yes, understory plants are really cool, and I do want to attribute them to carbon storage because they do that, it's just less than the above ground. Yeah, great question. Cool. Well, I guess I'll say thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Thanks so much for coming, everybody. Really appreciate it.